At its peak, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's landmass and a fifth of its population. They ruled the seas, dominated trade, and built an empire so vast that the sun quite literally never set on it. But here's the part they didn't tell you in history class. That empire came at a staggering cost, an estimated $10 trillion in today's money. From endless wars and failed invasions to colonial rebellions and economic disasters, today we're breaking down how Britain's quest to rule the world turned into a financial black hole and why the bill was way higher than you think. Let's start with a war that Winston Churchill called the first true world war, the 7 Years' War. This wasn't just a European conflict. It stretched across North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the Philippines. Britain fought France for global dominance, racking up a war debt of £130 million, about $150 billion today. To fund this war, Britain borrowed heavily, introduced new taxes, and raised tariffs. But the real cost came afterward. The debts led directly to the infamous Stamp Act and Townshend Acts, which enraged the American colonies and set the stage for, you guessed it, the American Revolution. The American Revolution wasn't just a political disaster, it was an economic catastrophe. Britain deployed over 50,000 troops and 30,000 German mercenaries, Hessians, across the Atlantic, funded a massive naval blockade, and spent today's equivalent of $300 billion trying to crush the rebellion. By 1783, Britain had lost not only the colonies, but also the most profitable part of its empire. The debts were so massive that British taxpayers were still paying them off well into the 19th century. In other words, Britain went all in and lost big. But if you think that was bad, wait until we get to India. After losing America, Britain turned to India, the so-called jewel in the crown. But conquering and ruling 300 million people wasn't just about soldiers and muskets. It was about money, a lot of it. Over the course of 2 centuries, Britain spent an estimated $1 trillion in today's money on wars, administration, and infrastructure just to keep India in its grip. Let's break that down. First, there were the wars. The Anglo-Mysore Wars, the Anglo-Maratha Wars, and the Anglo-Sikh Wars, each costing billions in today's money. For instance, the Anglo-Sikh Wars alone drained Britain's treasury by an estimated £15 million back then, about $5 billion today. And then there was the 1857 Sepoy Mutiny, India's first war of independence. Suppressing this rebellion cost Britain over £50 million at the time, roughly $15 billion today. The rebellion nearly ended British rule, forcing London to dissolve the East India Company and establish the British Raj, adding even more administrative costs. But Britain didn't just conquer India, they extracted its wealth. Indian textile exports were taxed into oblivion, allowing British factories to dominate global markets. Economist Utsa Patnaik estimated that Britain siphoned off over $45 trillion in today's value from India between 1765 and 1938 through taxes and trade manipulations. Meanwhile, Indians were taxed up to 50% of their income to pay for their own subjugation. Famines caused by British policies killed tens of millions, and yet the money kept flowing to London. And let's not forget infrastructure, the railways, telegraph lines, and ports. Britain spent over £400 million, about $100 billion today, on Indian infrastructure. But there's a catch. These projects were designed to extract resources, not develop the country. Freight rates for Indian goods were kept sky high, making it cheaper to ship raw cotton to Britain than between Indian cities. By the time Britain left in 1947, India was one of the world's poorest nations, despite having been one of the richest before colonization. That's what $1 trillion buys you when you're the one paying the bill. But Britain's addiction to profit didn't stop in India. Let's talk about one of the most controversial chapters in British imperial history, the Opium Wars. To fix its trade deficit with China, Britain forced Indian opium into Chinese markets, creating millions of addicts and a diplomatic crisis. By 1839, Britain was exporting 40,000 chests of opium a year, each worth today's equivalent of $500,000. When China banned opium, Britain declared war, twice. Between naval campaigns, reparations, and military costs, the two wars drained over $200 billion in today's money. The cost wasn't just financial. Britain's actions crippled China's economy and sovereignty, sowing the seeds for future conflicts. When we talk about the British Empire, it's impossible to ignore the Middle East, the strategic crossroads between Europe, Asia, and Africa. For Britain, controlling the Middle East wasn't just about land, it was about protecting the crown jewel, India, and securing oil supplies to fuel its navy. Let's start with the Suez Canal, built by the French but controlled by Britain by 1882. This wasn't just a canal, it was the lifeline of the British Empire, cutting travel time between India and Britain by 6,000 miles. To secure it, Britain spent an estimated £100 million, around $30 billion today, on military garrisons, fortifications, and naval patrols. During World War I, the British Empire launched the Mesopotamia campaign to secure oil fields in what is now Iraq. But this campaign turned into a logistical nightmare. Unprepared for desert warfare, British forces suffered massive losses at the Siege of Kut, where over 13,000 troops were besieged and forced to surrender. By the end of the campaign, Britain had spent £80 million, or about $50 billion today, to secure a region that would soon be engulfed in revolts. It was an expensive reminder that conquering the Middle East was one thing, holding it was another. After World War I, Britain wasn't just fighting to keep India, it was trying to hold on to the entire Middle East. Egypt, Iraq, Palestine, Transjordan, all came under British control under the Mandate system. But instead of profits, Britain got a bill for endless revolts and military expenses. Between 1920 and 1940, Britain spent today's equivalent of $100 billion trying to control the Middle East, largely funded by Indian and Egyptian taxes. In the end, the British Empire left the region bankrupt, unstable, and full of resentment. If the Suez was Britain's shortcut, oil was its fuel. By 1914, Britain's navy had switched from coal to oil, most of it sourced from the Persian Gulf. Securing those supplies wasn't cheap. The Royal Navy protected oil fields, tankers, and pipelines, costing an estimated $150 billion in today's money by the start of World War II. Ironically, the money spent securing Middle Eastern oil would haunt Britain after World War II, as the US moved in and took over most of those oil contracts, leaving Britain broke and outmaneuvered. So, between the Suez Canal, the Mesopotamia campaign, and the cost of keeping the oil flowing, Britain burned through at least $500 billion trying to control the Middle East, only to lose it all in less than a century. And this was just one part of the $10 trillion tab that finally broke the British Empire. But if you think the Middle East was expensive, wait until we talk about the World Wars. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Instead, it nearly ended the British Empire. Britain mobilized 8.9 million soldiers and spent a staggering £9 billion, over $500 billion today. By 1918, Britain's national debt had quadrupled. Desperate for cash, Britain issued war bonds and borrowed heavily from the US, creating a debt so massive that it would haunt the empire for decades. The war left Britain financially crippled and set the stage for the next catastrophe, World War II. By 1939, Britain was already broke, but Hitler's ambitions left them no choice. Over 6 years, Britain spent $3 trillion defending its empire and liberating Europe. The Lend-Lease Act was a lifeline, but at a cost. Britain was forced to mortgage its gold reserves and sell off key assets to the US. By 1945, Britain's debt was 240% of its GDP, so high that the final payments weren't made until 2006. The British Empire emerged victorious but bankrupt.